Hello people, this video is called 5 Eras of Constitutional Amendments. So the constitutional amendments, I argue, can be classified into 5 different historical eras. Amendments cluster in time, with each time representing its own distinct concerns, and each set of amendments attempting to address those concerns. So the first era of amendments took place between 1791 and 1804, and it includes amendments 1 through 12. The purpose of the amendments of this era was to tweak the original Constitution. So the first 10 amendments, as you already know, are known as the Bill of Rights. Madison wrote them, Congress edited them, and states ratified them. The content of those amendments is not the subject of this video. We will address them repeatedly in future videos. So Amendment 11, which actually was ratified in 1795, only 4 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, made it impossible for a state to be sued in a federal court by a non-citizen without the state's consent. This amendment was a direct response by Congress and by the states to the Supreme Court decision in Chisholm versus Georgia, and I will link to that case in the description of the video. So the outcome of the amendment was to strengthen state sovereignty, to give states more power. The 12th Amendment was a response to the elections of 1796 and 1800. Two very important presidential elections. The 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, made it so that electors, when they vote for president, cast a separate vote, one for president, one for vice president. And this modified Section 1 of Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which provided that number 1 vote getter in electoral college vote becomes president, and number 2 vote getter becomes vice president. Now, this resulted in awkward situations in 1796 and 1804, because in 1796, John Adams was the first vote getter. He became president, and his political rival, Thomas Jefferson, became vice president. So president and vice president belonged to two different political parties. Then, in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, and Aaron Burr, another Democratic Republican, tied in the Electoral College vote, with John Adams coming in distant third. And so nobody had majority of Electoral College votes, which resulted in Congress choosing Thomas Jefferson president on the 36th ballot. And so in order to prevent this difficulty with who would be president, who would be vice president, and in order to prevent situations in which president belongs to one political party and vice president to another political party, an amendment was ratified. So we see here that Amendments 10 through 12 try to tweak the Constitution. They supplement what it was missing, that is to say, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and then they give the states more power, so they tweak the balance of power through the 11th Amendment, and then they make presidential elections smoother, because the founders, when they wrote the Constitution, were hoping that political parties would not exist at all. And so in order for partisan presidential elections to go smoothly in the future, the 12th Amendment was actually ratified in 1804. Now, the next era was from 1865 and 1870, and it resulted in 3 amendments. Amendments 13, 14, and 15. These are the post-Civil War amendments. So they deal with abolition of slavery and its aftermath. 13th Amendment, of course, abolished slavery. 14th Amendment is the one that we will very frequently encounter in future videos, and that amendment for the first time defined national citizenship constitutionally. In the past, there was no such constitutional definition. In the past, Congress had defined national citizenship. So the 14th Amendment provided that any person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen of the United States and of the state wherein he resides. And the 14th Amendment also included the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which over time proved to be not very important. But it also includes the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, both of which are incredibly important, and both of which we will encounter in future videos. In particular, Due Process Clause, which is the staple of the civil liberties subject, because it's a conduit between the content of the Bill of Rights and its applicability against state and local governments, as we shall see. The 15th Amendment actually stipulated that you cannot deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, that a state may not deny the right to vote based on these things. So we clearly see that this is a reaction. The common theme of amendments here is to react to the aftermath of the Civil War. And then the next cluster or era of amendments is between 1913 and 1920. It's the beginning of the modern world. And it is modern in a sense that if you were born late in the 20th century or even early in the 21st century, you would be able to relate kind of on the emotional and spiritual level to this era. It's different. It just feels more modern, unlike 19th century or 18th century. So you have here Amendments 16, 17, 18, and 19. Amendment 16 greatly increased the power of national government because it enabled Congress to collect revenue from any source, and that meant income taxes. So Congress, for the first time, was legally able to tax any income of any person, natural, meaning a human being, or artificial, or corporation, anything that it wanted as far as income it could tax. And that began to bring a lot of money into the national treasury. The 17th Amendment actually established the direct election of U.S. senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, and by the way, both Amendments 16 and 17 were ratified in 1913. So prior to the 17th Amendment, U.S. senators were not directly elected by the people. They rather were appointed by state legislatures. The 18th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919, is the so-called prohibition. It prohibited manufacturing and sale of alcohol within the United States. And the 19th Amendment is very important because it guaranteed the right to vote irrespective of sex. So women were finally guaranteed the right to vote at the national level. Prior to this amendment, women were only able to vote in some states and territories and in some elections. But the 19th Amendment actually guaranteed everyone the right to vote. Anyone who was over 21 could vote in any election. Now, the next era is 1933 to 1935, and that is the era in which the modern world is refined. And it's actually very easy to understand how it is refined. For example, the 20th Amendment changes the dates on which the terms of the president and vice president and the members of Congress begin and end. So for Congress, it's January 3rd. For president, it's January 20th. The really crucial part here is the president. Before the 20th Amendment, president would be inaugurated on March 4th. So this long transition from the first week of November until the first week of March. So how long is that? December, January, February, March, 4 months. This 4 months long transition seemed reasonable to founders because transportation and communication were really slow in the 18th century. But in the 20th century, they were much faster. So clearly you had an updated system. But the real catalyst for this was really the arrival of the Great Depression following the stock market crash in October of 1929. So unemployment began to rise in 1930. And by 1932, the country was in the depth of the Depression with roughly 25% unemployment rate. And President Hoover seemed to be unable to take the bold steps necessary to solve the problem. And so the country had to wait longer because of that. Roosevelt was elected president in November of 1932, but he would not be inaugurated until March of 1933. So an amendment was quickly written and quickly ratified in 1933 to allow president to take office on January 20th. And then we have, of course, the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. So this is a refinement of the modern world, in that we found in this modern world that excessive temperance doesn't work. Prohibition doesn't work. And so we tried it, doesn't work, in a very American fashion. We said, okay, the experiment didn't work. We are going to go back and allow alcohol again. And the 22nd Amendment limits the number of terms that one can be president. And of course, it limits it to 2. It was ratified in February of 1951. The catalyst was the 4-term presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt could not be defeated. He won 4 times, 32, 36, 40, and 44. And of course, he died in 1945, less than a year into his 4th term. So his presidency was a great lesson teacher. And no matter how popular he was, and he was widely popular during his presidency, the lesson was that perhaps you should limit presidents' terms to 8 years in office. And so this is exactly what happened in 1951. And finally, we have the 5th, and so far, the last era of constitutional amendments, and that's the Civil Rights Amendments. So that's from 1961 to 1992. So in 1961, we get our 23rd Amendment, and it finally enfranchises the voters of Washington, D.C. So I include it as part of the civil rights because it enfranchises the previously disenfranchised, and the majority of Washington, D.C. are African Americans too. The thing here is that the Constitution provides for presidential election votes on a state-by-state basis, but Washington, D.C. is not and has never been a state. It has always been its own special federal district created on land ceded by Virginia and Maryland, and was the result of the compromise between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. So a national bank was established, and like Hamilton wanted, and the capital of the United States was moved to the south, to the Potomac River, which is what Jefferson wanted. And so you have this new city, which serves as capital of the United States, and yet the voters living in the city couldn't vote because they were not living in a state. So the 23rd Amendment remedied this situation. And then we had the 24th Amendment, which prohibited the revocation of voting rights due to non-payment of a poll tax or any other tax. And this was very specifically meant to combat this prohibition on part of southern states in order to make it difficult to impossible for African Americans to vote. So that was the 24th Amendment. And then in 1967, the 25th Amendment was ratified, and it addresses succession to the presidency and establishes procedures both to fill in a vacancy in the office of the vice president and responding to presidential disabilities. So the greatest importance here is to clarify presidential succession. The 26th Amendment is the one that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, also very clearly a civil rights amendment because it enfranchised people who could in fact get married, because if you're 18 you can and you could at the time get married in any state of the United States. You could enlist in the military and go and kill and die for your country. You could have children. You could even run for some state and local offices, but you couldn't vote. And so remember, this was during the Vietnam era. The Vietnam War was still on. So this amendment enfranchised the youngest group of adults, between those between ages of 18 to 21. And finally, we have the 27th Amendment, which is the most recent as of this recording. And it was ratified in 1992. It can be considered the Civil Rights Amendment, or at the very least the Civil Liberties Amendment. And remember, it was part of the original Bill of Rights, but it was one of the two amendments which was not ratified by the states. As you recall, Congress passed 12, not 10 Bill of Rights amendments, but the first two did not get ratified. So what happened is, in 1992, this dead amendment was resurrected by Congress. It passed it again, sent it to the states for ratification, and the states ratified. This amendment stipulates that if Congress changes its own salary, the change doesn't go into effect until after the next election, when new Congress is seated. Okay? So if Congress, let's say, increases its own salary in September of 2022, that increase will not go into effect until January 3rd of 2023. And the idea here was to place a popular check on Congress not giving itself too many salary increases too often. So this is very clearly an attempt to control Congress not feeding itself at the national taxpayers' trough, so to speak. And this is it. So if you are younger than 50, as of this recording, if you're younger than 50, in your lifetime, there was only one amendment. That's the 27th Amendment. And even that amendment was initially written by Madison in 1789. So really, if you think about it, if you're under 50 years old, there were no new amendments in your lifetime. It's quite remarkable. So we've gone over these different eras of amendments, and perhaps we can say that we have reached a certain dead end, maybe, in American political philosophy, because we no longer have these great eras with a bunch of amendments, with 3 to 5 to 6 amendments coming online almost right next to each other, temporally speaking. So maybe we have reached a certain final destination, so to speak, of American political philosophy, because there are no more great needs for clusters of amendments. Anyway, I hope you learned from this video, and I will see you in the next one.